distinctively, and that's before a lot of the new research. But in terms of what experience I had, it was probably an experience with a dolphin. I was trying to learn how to surf off of Los Angeles. And I never became a surfer because I kept getting distracted by dolphins. And one dolphin really came up and checked me out. And to have that intimacy with a wild animal and just such an intentional intimacy, it blew me away. And then I saw something about people on TV studying dolphins as scientists and studying how they communicate with each other, dolphins together, and then with humans. And I was like, wow, I can do this. So I went back to school and knew I had to get a doctorate in this if I was going to study something that was not part of the convention. So that's pretty much my aha moment.
That's great. Thank you. Um, if you had to choose one thing that you like best about this work, what is it? I mean, what's most important to you about it?
Um, Initially, I would say selfishly, just having an excuse to be around wildlife and around nature. And uh, but really the big payoff in this work is when my research is used, even as a small part of something that makes a difference. And as you may know, Jennifer, working in the field where we're protecting the environment, anything, marginalized environments or communities of humans, any of these, uh, when we're striving for justice for those who don't necessarily have the voice that they should at the table, the results are far and few between that are visible. But when we have big wins, like for example, when you announced that the Land Trust was able to protect this large area of land, it's more than that. I mean, you're preserving microcultures and of animals and plants and trees, and it's just it's so much more than we know when we hear about it, or even when we hike through there. It's got its own history of place. So that's really magical. And so we may not always win our fights, but we can be part of the solution sometimes.
Yeah, it's great to watch all of your data used in a way that's useful for making change in policy. Okay, so with that, before I want to leave time for your presentation, I know it will go by fast, so I'm going to turn it over to you. And I think you should have the ability to screen share.
I will do that right now. And let's see. Okay, here we go. I might interrupt my presentation midway just to check in with you all because I'm speaking into a great void, and see if there's any questions and make sure that you all can still hear me all right. So the focus of my talk is on something that I call wild wisdom. And I'm going to focus on communicating with other animals and nature. And first I should ask, Jennifer, can you see my PowerPoint all right?
Did you hear me okay? Or did you see my?
I can hear you.
Yes, this it's all good. It looks great.
Good deal.
All good over here too.
Okay, good to know. So basically, when we're communicating with other animals in nature, it's not communicating with them necessarily in the same way we communicate with each other, because other animals aren't always verbal, but they certainly can transmit signals and understand each other. And we can do that with them because we, of course, are animals. So I'm going to go through somewhat 3 stages in my talk today. One is about our animal selves as being part of nature, that this false dichotomy or duality that we've been enculturated to believe in is really not biologically or ecologically correct, and that we are part of nature, at least in our own ways. And second, I did send out through Jennifer an experiment that I called it, about communicating and communing with other animals. And we might want to discuss some of that. And then lastly, to address and perhaps discuss how do we respond to the needs of nature, because of course there's so many these days. So next, I really want to start with how many of us have been especially nurtured by nature throughout this pandemic. I think most land trust people are folks who, when they have the opportunity, go out into nature anyway. But a lot of people who really didn't feel a big connection with the great outdoors or consider themselves outdoorsy became that way, perhaps by necessity, during this last year and a half. So that's been interesting. It'll be very fascinating to see how that pans out. And we know that there are wonderful healing aspects of nature. There's, of course, what is known as biophilia, our innate attraction to nature and the way that it can have positive impacts on us. Some people call this a form of ecotherapy, being in nature. And there's something called forest bathing that was somewhat trendy even before the lockdowns. So these are things that we knew before, but it will be fascinating to find out how they pan out. One of the things that we've discovered also during this time, I would say, whether or not we've been outdoors more or whether or not we're online more looking at nature, is how much of a more than human world we live in. And I love this picture. I don't know the artist, so I can't credit him or her, but it really, like myself, I was missing traveling to more far off places. So I was hiking with people in other parts of the world on GoPro or other things. So we all had our ways of experiencing this more than human world. Some people are just outside taking walks more in the city and meeting crows in more or different ways, and squirrels. So when we see this more than human world, we look to nature to provide recreational experiences, even to heal us. But simultaneously, we know we are hurting that which we need to survive and thrive, the earth we share. And unfortunately, over the last few hundred years, particularly, we have normalized taking from nature. So there's a unidirectional relationship. And a lot of people really think that this is our time to give back. It's not maybe even enough just to be reciprocal with nature. We really need to give back and nurture her. So we can do better with a more reciprocal relationship, one that acknowledges our interdependence with the natural world. And that is what wild wisdom is about. So part of what we've been seeing for decades, let alone this last year, is in the headlines, the problems of the world and how our ecosystems are suffering. And for example, this article about 3% of world's ecosystems remain intact. And yes, these issues are important and they can be overwhelming for many of us. A lot of people ask me, how do you find hope in doing this work? Because a lot of you probably already know things can be disheartening, and we have the climate crisis and so many things that we see right in front of us. But there is always hope, because there is still so much more. Even if it's not 100% pristine, it's still life, and we have this life to protect. So I would suggest that as we decide ways in which we need to remedy these situations. We know the mechanical causes and the mechanistic causes, but I like to look at how did we get here, in both our philosophy, our attitude toward nature, and of course, the policies that result. And my work has taken me to conclude that a lot of this stems from the myth of human exceptionalism. And I want to discuss this a little bit. It's not simply my term, but this can be defined as a Western belief that we are separate from and superior to nature, regardless of the data, the very compelling data that shows that other animals are so much more intelligent and sentient than we ever could have imagined. And this has resulted in an anthropocentrism reflected in policy. And anthropocentrism is in many ways just we're anthropocentric. We look at the world through our eyes as if we are at the top of the hierarchy, and we create a hierarchy in which we place ourselves on top. But ecologically and biologically, we're not on top. We are not more evolved. We're just beautifully evolved with so many more species that we share the planet with. And so if we do consider ourselves at the top of a hierarchy, this exceptionalism lends us to see other species as objects to be exploited, commodified, extracted, and dominated. And that denies our common animality. And I'm sharing this New York Times opinion piece because I was drawn to the title, Humans Are Animals, Let's Get Over It. It's astonishing how relentlessly Western philosophy has strained to prove we are not squirrels. And I love that you see this classical Greek person, perhaps Aristotle, who's very upset because we want to believe that we're necessarily better or more evolved than squirrels. And certainly we have unique attributes, as many species do. But scientifically, even, it's just harder and harder to find these degrees of exceptionalism, what separates us from all other animals. And this is an article about a book that a colleague of mine wrote, The Joy of Being Animal. And she says, human exceptionalism is dead. For the sake of our own happiness and the planet, we should embrace our true animal nature. And again, this is not because of any romanticism about other animals. Yes, I study dolphins primarily and other wildlife, but dolphins and orcas are not necessarily better either than other animals, but they are good gateway species to connect with other people through. For example, I think they're good teachers because they're charismatic. And of course, they're special, but I think all species are. So anyway, we're in a new era of research that has been revealing an extraordinary array of cognitive, cultural, communicative, and psychological competencies in so many non-human species. And this translates into sentience. And you'll see here the film, My Octopus Teacher. And I have to say that I wish every person could make this film. And if I was a filmmaker, this is the film I wish I could have made, because it so exquisitely shows, I think, two things: how an octopus who doesn't even have a vertebrae or a centralized brain in the way that we do, how we have so much in common, perhaps in terms of affect, in terms of emotion, and how we can somehow find bonds with one another. It's not just the friendly dolphin who we might see. There can also be relationships that are cultivated without the provisioning of food, I should add, because we should never be feeding wild animals except in very controlled circumstances. So this film was sublime. And the other thing about it is it really literally takes you into what the eyes and the mind of an octopus might be. And the other photo you're looking at is that Nat Geo and so many publications and films are now talking about the intelligence of plants and trees, and not just that they have cognitive capacities, some of which are very elaborate, but they actually communicate with one another very directly, as well as with animals in their vicinity in ways that we humans often can't detect, at least until recently. And towards this end, I I can't neglect saying that words matter. Sometimes people are surprised when I say other animals, when I'm referring to other animals. But if I'm being a good scientist, I think that's only appropriate. Um, Also, when we know the gender of an animal, another animal, human or otherwise, he, she, they, is what is appropriate, not, and also instead of it, we would say who or whom. And even when I don't know the gender of a crow, I've really uh, done that because sometimes I don't always know the gender of a human person who's walking across the street. So I'm not going to refer to them as an it, perhaps a they, he, she. But even if I don't know how they identify or what their gender is. And again, we're talking about living beings, and we live amongst living beings, not living things, because how can a thing be living? And uh, when we see other animals for who they are, rather than merely what they are, then we can learn from them, not just about them. And of course, I have a picture of Jane Goodall because I want to have a photo of her in every presentation I give if I can. But for two reasons here. First of all, she has been using these pronouns for decades. She even named the chimpanzees she studied and was criticized and ridiculed for it. And now this is standard in the field. And she recently, just this year, came out with an appeal to the Associated Press, as she, as well as a lot of other scholars and NGOs, asking that the Associated Press stop using the word it to refer to other living animals. So she is the reason for a lot of things for which many of us are grateful, and this being one of many. And one of you mentioned the Sierra magazine, that's the article that I sent out. And this particular one is an op-ed by Jason Mark titled Animals Are Persons Too, an insistence on the worth of every animal matters more than ever. And I love that Sierra put this out. And my favorite statement in this is the fresh findings about animal cognition bring new depth to the old law. They offer an opportunity to recommit to the ideals that have long animated the environmental movement. And while we're talking about non-human animals being our brothers and sisters, so to speak, our kinship with them, our interdependence with them, I certainly cannot avoid, nor would I want to, talking about indigenous peoples of the world, because of course we can't generify them, but largely the indigenous people's perspective is so different than the post-colonial perspective, in that we are part of nature, and that so many of the things that I or others would say are wild wisdom, really, it sounds cool, but it's really just something that has existed between indigenous peoples and the nature around them for millennia, before we kind of turned everything upside down and shook it up. So I've been very fortunate. This is a photo of the a band of the Nuu-chah-nulth in British Columbia, and I worked for them to help with an orca who was lost in their region. Some of you might have heard of her. Her name, him actually, his name was Luna. And so yeah, indigenous peoples have taught me a lot, and I've also learned a lot from nature. So I want to talk a little bit about behavior and communication, just like the 101 single slide or two. But But there is an expression, for those of you who know German, I always mess this word up. Umwelt is a scientific term for describing each organism's unique sensory world. So I'm an ethologist, so I study the behavior of other animals and sometimes human animals. And that's part of it, that each organism has his or her own sometimes completely different way of seeing their environment and perhaps feeling their bodies as well. So it's not always how we see things, it's how all the myriad animals and plants around us, how they perceive the world too, which makes it all more rich and complex and beautiful, I think. And it's appreciating the differences between a plant and myself, and the similarities. And also, when we're talking about some species, it is more than species, it's individual personalities and even cultures. You may have heard how a lot of orcas and elephants and crows and ravens, how they exhibit tool making, they have cultures, they transmit knowledge across generations and have intergenerational wisdom. And if we're going to talk about communication, we want to look at how others experience the world. In fact, this is Mara, a dolphin who was in the wild, in Ireland, who chose to interact with people. And I'm not suggesting that everybody go out trying to meet wild dolphins, because it's always has to be on their terms, because we can disturb them a lot more than we think. But this just happened after many days of me being out there, and really just her curiosity. Now, this is not me in the photo with Mara. This is a dolphin with a dog. And this dolphin, I think people named him Doogie. He was in Northern Ireland. And he and this dog, free-ranging dolphin, they swam together almost every single day. This dog just could not wait to get in the water with this dolphin. So, of course, this points out that we're not the only interesting animals on the block. I mean, dolphins can prefer being with dogs sometimes in the water, and then I'm just another primate in the water, and I may not hold that much interest to that dolphin. Perhaps their friendship with a dog will steal the show. And also, these two animals also have very different sensory systems and ways of communicating, but somehow they find ways to have a very beautiful bond. Jennifer, can I just get an audio, or is everything going all right from you on your end?
Yes, very good.
Okay, so speaking of dolphins, not to be dolphin centric, which I guess I am, and I apologize for that, but this photo was taken at a captive dolphin swim program. And this is a trained behavior where dolphins push people around. And other animals may perceive us quite differently than we would imagine. And this slide kind of epitomizes that, because dolphins always have a smile on their face, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are enjoying what they're doing. It's a fixed facial feature. And so, and I used to think these programs were pretty cool myself. So it's not to disparage anybody who's ever participated in these type of things, but I didn't know better about how much suffering these dolphins could be enduring while they look so happy. And because we think they look happy, or they make sounds that we think are cute, and they could actually be signs of distress. So this is how similarly we've evolved to be air-breathing mammals, and also how differently we've evolved. So sometimes we think that we're participating, myself included, in interspecies communication. And sometimes I'll realize later, wow, on my part, that was big time miscommunication, because I see things so much through my eyes. And so I'm hoping that I and we as a species can become more adept at being open to other ways of communicating, or at least being more receptive to that. And I want to share an example of this this is one dolphin who represents many dolphins in an area of Brazil where there is communication and collaboration between generations of dolphins and generations of indigenous fishermen who have lived there. And so literally, this has been scientifically documented. It's still so cool to talk about how that each family, I guess, works with certain dolphins. And again, this is multi-generational dolphins and humans. And the dolphins will help herd the fish into the nets. And the fishermen will then give the dolphins some of that, and they'll share. And this is a beautiful example of interspecies, not just communication, but collaboration. And again, this has to be on their terms. If we're ever going to be in tune with nature, our own human nature, the nature around us, it has to be on their terms. When it's not, then it's not authentic. It's more in our heads than in our real embodied reality. So these are gray whales, if you haven't already figured that out. This is in Baja, San Ignacio Lagoon. And this is a mother gray whale and with her baby who came up to my colleague because they love to be touched. And this is something that evolved over maybe, gosh, definitely decades. But it's strictly because these interactions always occur on the terms of the whales, at least as much as possible. And it's not just about going and touching whales. In fact, my friend here, who's a photographer, she didn't want to touch any whales. She just wanted to be as out of the way as possible. And this whale just kept coming up to her, until finally I said, Robin, please connect. And so I don't know if the whale wanted a massage or just really was curious about her. I have no idea. But one last thing about this aspect of whales in Baja and their connection with humans. This same area was an area where the gray whales were almost completely extirpated from the West Coast. And these breeding and nursing lagoons, these nurseries, once ran red with the blood of these whales, and during the 1800s. And somehow, and this is the potential that we have, there can be such a healing of these rifts where literally you can go from one extreme of almost extirpating an entire species to seeing members of these species actually interacting sociable communication with us. So it's a really true story and beautiful one of resilience. And again, it's an example of being ecocentric rather than, I used the word anthropocentric earlier. And I took this photo somewhere in California. I like how the sign talks about protecting the seals, and underneath they said, we seals are citizens too. And in a way, I mean, they're stakeholders. They've been here at these beaches longer than most of us have, at least non-Indigenous folks. So these things are possible. And of course, we have a long way to come. We do have the opportunity of looking at wild animals or any other animals instead of looking at them as resources to be used by us. We can look at them with respect, and we can then treat them with respect. And again, instead of learning just about them, we know so much about them already. We can learn from them. And especially in the case of elephants, we didn't even know that they were vocalizing as much as they are. And then Katie Payne and a few others found that they were communicating over hundreds and thousands of miles through the land in subsonic frequencies that we can't hear. So again, it's how we see our world, and like, wow, they really are staying connected. They're not as discrete and separate as we thought they are. So as scientists and sometimes as naturalists, we are collecting data in a traditional way. This is our neighbor, one of our neighbor coyotes. And when we're collecting data, it's obvious, it's often the observer versus the subject. And that does create a dichotomy. And I love data. I'm collecting data all the time. I'm creating data sheets. So I'm not always espousing or practicing wild wisdom, except I hope I am in the way of being respectful. But collecting data is great as long as it's being respectful and as long as we are recognizing that all observation is intimate. When I was showing this photo to Jennifer, I was talking about how I thought I wasn't bothering this coyote, and this coyote didn't even probably see me at first. And then I thought, wait a second, of course, look at the orientation of the ears. They don't necessarily see as their primary mode of perception. Sometimes hearing and smell is much more important. So simply because he wasn't facing me didn't mean he wasn't attentive to me, which could be good or it could be bad, because I don't want to disturb the coyotes, even though this coyote is of course beautiful. And then that brings the question, who is observing whom? So often we think we're observing, especially scientists, we're observing animals in the wild and we're not being intrusive. And then we'll come up with a different way of collecting data and think, wow, we really were disturbing them with our boat, or we really were intervening in their feeding. So again, I'm using an anthro word, but this is anthropomorphizing. A lot of people say that we're anthropomorphizing. This is the old school. If we think that other animals have sentience, intelligence, the capacities to feel extreme emotions such as pain and joy, which we're not, because the neurological and the physiological data are replete in substantiating that. But we don't have to anthropomorphize. We don't have to project any human feelings, emotions, or senses onto other animals. We don't have to, because they are already so amazing and they have demonstrated such capacities in their own right. It's not a matter of anthropomorphizing. It's looking at, again, through their eyes. And in this sense, my field of ethology, I've realized, needs to go more in the direction of anthropology, because I am seen, I am heard. I can create a blind and maybe I'll be undetected, but very, very hard not to be. And I can't create blinds everywhere I go to hide behind. And still there are things like scent and other things that I'm communicating. So it's about understanding and respecting similarities and differences when we're collecting data or just being in the presence. And in conclusion, this segment, I was lucky enough to spend time amongst elephants in East Africa, not just to learn about and from the elephants, but to learn from some of the Maasai and the Samburu people who live there and have lived there for generations. And I mean, this is it. When I have teachers such as these, I still have so much to learn, but we can learn so much from so many. And from that, I didn't know if we wanted to talk about if anybody did this this experiment of just being in nature, exploring different ways of being, exploring awareness of our own animality. But some of these points here in this paper, or maybe you have the digital version, were taken from these experiences with, let's say, elephants and indigenous peoples, intentionally exploring ways of being with nature and with plants, animals, both as an observer and as a participant. So perhaps we can start by talking about that. This is the overview of our five senses, our minds, our bodies, our breathing, our emotions and moods, our instinct, or sometimes what we feel in our gut or sixth sense. These all come into play. And scientists are increasingly admitting that we do need to be aware of these things because we are influencing the animals we're studying when we, and especially if we're not attentive to these things. So I will leave it up to Jennifer to see if we want to just talk about things, questions, or if you want to talk about our awareness experiment. But in conclusion, I just hope that this presentation has done something towards redefining what we have been considering this inclusiveness and our interdependence. And with that, I will turn this over to Jennifer. But one more thing, I want to thank you, you folks at the Santa Barbara Land Trust, for all that you do. As somebody who lives in Santa Barbara, I benefit so much from being on a lot of the land that you have protected. And your vision, I went to your website and I saw a future with, at least as part of your vision, a future with conserved lands throughout the country, the country, that engage and nourish both human and more than human lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Toni. So before I open it up to questions, I'd just like to kind of piggyback on a couple of Toni's last slides. Is anybody interested in sharing if you had a chance to do the experiment or exercise out in nature? Does anybody want to share about that? I can start us off real quick. We have about 10 minutes. And I would just like to share that less on my experience, but the process in my mind used to be, I have a degree in zoology and have been through naturalist trainings and have been trained basically when I go out as go bird watching or go want to take any type of observation or collect data. I've had a very strict training, record date, time, environment, weather patterns, all of this stuff, species name, description, behavior, what was it doing, and all of this. And I've helped out in so many different projects that required that type of data collection, that this was a nice change in that just to kind of move away. It was refreshing to move away and just go. I didn't really do more than just sit out near my apartment and, noticed the direction of the sun, how my skin felt, and I have so many different animals. I'm surrounded by animals. In fact, what's happened is my awareness about all of the life around me is just, it keeps expanding because I'm paying attention more. And so this exercise was nice in that there's more to it than what I've been trained to do in a traditional sense with observing my surroundings. So that I appreciated that a lot, Toni.
Thanks for sharing that. And I love that. Yeah, sometimes just being aware of who is around us. Like I said, the more exotic or charismatic the animal, they're not necessarily the most interesting animals. I learned so much just from watching, but from watching the crows around our house. And it's just amazing. And one of my editors at Yale University Press, she created a book. I wish I had the book next to me about the culture of crows and ravens. And so here I've been just trying to watch them both scientifically and non-scientifically. And yeah, they're amazing beings, even though they're loud. And then when I complain about them, like, wow, we're that much louder. So who am I to say? But thanks for sharing that.
Toni, I can make a comment. I don't know can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, just doing gardening around the house, using these five senses. I've been noticing just how many bees are having fun out there, making use of all the flowers. I've also have a storage shed, and there's been an animal that has been digging to live under the storage shed. And so I just kind of leave it intact the way they've got it there and just let them go in and out. I still have him or her go in and out. I haven't figured out what type of animal it is. It could be a bunny, it could be a skunk. I'm not really sure. Have another one that's going under the patio. Same thing. I don't know what kind of animal it is. Also have a bunch of lizards. But one of the things that I've really been enjoying in the yard is that I have a half wine barrel that I've been using to store the hose in. And probably 6 months ago, I had taken the hose out and found a little frog in there. And then for a while, just a few months back, all of a sudden there were 2 frogs in there. And then when I watered today, there were 4 frogs in there. So they're just tiny, tiny little frogs that are hanging out in a wine barrel that you won't even know they're in there, except for the fact you're taking the hose out to water. So now using my senses is something where, you visualize these things. You're talking about emotions and mood. It's, and anticipation and joy and excitement. I mean, I get all those things just from trying to figure out how many frogs now are going to be inside that, half wine barrel that I'm using to store the hose. So I just thought, and one other example of this is that I've done a lot of hiking. And I used to go with groups, and the goal was to see how fast you can just go up a trail. But now it's like, I don't hike with those like that anymore. I just usually go on my own. And it's just fun to experience everything that you're experiencing, just taking a slow hike and seeing what you discover along the way. So anyway, those are my examples of using your experiment and how I've done that in the past or how I'm doing it currently.
Well, I love that. And in full transparency, Craig, who's just shared that, is my husband. And I hadn't talked to you about this exercise. So thanks for sharing that. And I'm so excited about the frogs, our little frog neighbors. But I love also, because I know you and you told me you were very gentle in taking the hose out and then, letting them jump out of the barrel, gradually. So it's not just a panic and you're not injuring anyone. The way in which we're gentle in the world, to me, it allows for so much life and so much discovery. And so thanks for sharing that.
I'd like to make a quick comment on consciousness. I've been doing some research in the undifferentiated state of consciousness. And the main characteristic there is really silence, or is simply, it has no characteristics actually. And so it cannot be spoken of, but I'm going to speak about it in the sense of silence. And my experience with all of nature, and certainly the animals as well, and I think of St. Francis and the birds, is when you enter into silence with the animals, with all of nature, but we'll speak about the animals, because in some ways it's like, oh, there's a mountain lion, let's go into silence. But the idea of silence, and what arises so spontaneously, is unconditional love. And so with our appreciation of all this extraordinary, as you were mentioning, the complexity that just blows your mind, is a profound sense of appreciation. So it's like taking the awareness of an undifferentiated state, and you cannot increase awareness. Awareness is awareness. But we expand and deepen our gratitude. And I think that's just a beautiful place to live your life. And then there's a harmony that is very spontaneous and that goes beyond any confusion of language, whether it's anthropomorphic or it just, so there it is. I will end on silence.
That is beautiful, Catherine. Really, really beautiful. And not to interrupt the silence, but I will, for the sake of our discussion, sometimes people use the word, the term animal whisper, and not to disparage any animal whisperers if they're in it, but I really tried to identify more as an animal listener, and now more a plant and tree listener, because it's different. But listening with all my senses, all my being, my entire presence, and because, of course, today I spoke a lot, but yes, we're taught to, yeah, it's kind of like we're taught to speak, but are we taught to listen, and especially to others who may not have the loudest voices or speak English or have any audible voice, but just visually are present, like a newt or a gecko.
That's the term that's being used, isn't it? That's going from animal whisperer to animal listener, because I've heard that before, that there's a shift in nomenclature speaking about grammar and languaging. And that's what I've heard before as well.
I hope so. I
Yeah.
hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up, because it highlights that we need to shift that perspective, that understanding, because what do we have to say?
Exactly.
Here's my view on what you're experiencing. Yeah. Yeah. Projections. I'm sure, well, I don't want to monopolize, but just, John Wheeler's participatory universe, you're familiar with that? About how, as an observer, so you're talking about collecting data, but how, as the observer, you impact, so very quantum here, you impact the measurements that you will then in turn receive, right? So that which you measure is what you get back in simple terms. And I love what's going on now is more and more this appreciation of looking around at all of nature. And if we're starting to participate in that way, then we are enhancing exponentially the consciousness around the planet. So even though it's saying, well, what can I do? In that very small little gesture of just shifting, bingo, right there, exponential impact through the silence.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I forgot to mention something about, speaking of collecting data, there is an opportunity that we're offering for, we're having an event, Dolphin Watch Day, and we'll put out something formal. But if we're hoping to have a citizen science project. We did this almost 30 years ago. And when I lived in LA, people helping to watch dolphins and perhaps listen, but mostly watch and count and try to connect our coastal communities across the divide there by being more aware of dolphins and learning more about them. So please, if anybody wants to participate, I invite you to contact me.
Do you know when that will be, Toni?
I'm not quite sure what the date will be. We might have a trial run in July, but I'll let you know when we have a final date. I'm thinking early autumn.
So it's 1:30. I would like to give anybody else a chance to ask a question before we all sign off.
I do have to sign off, but I want to thank you, Toni, very much, and Jennifer, you as well, and all the other participants. I've really, really enjoyed this webinar, so thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Catherine.
Same here.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Beverly. All right. I have actually everybody has Toni's info, email address if you want to get in touch about the Protect Our Dolphin Neighbors event, citizen science event. And with that, I have it recorded if anybody would like to pass on the recording. And Toni, I'd like to thank you again, and we'll connect soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.